Just going to start off with like a quick round of thank yous. First of all, thank you to Dr. Dalal Faris for tracking me down and finding me after like one Zoom talk we had, and for giving me this opportunity to present what is I'm hoping to turn into a book chapter, because this is part of a research that I started about 2 months ago. And I also want to thank Dr. Khalid Al-Bahri for organizing the logistics and for the flyer. I want to give a very, very special shout out to the woman who actually inspired me to do this. Anne Abunda, who is the founder of Sandigan Kuwait. And it's an organization for domestic workers, to raise awareness. And I met Anne and I met the workers a couple of months ago, and my life has completely transformed ever since I met her. So, Anne, honey, this is for you. So without further ado, I'm going to start. So, feminist schools of thought predominantly focus on equality and legal enfranchisement, especially around issues related to rights and liberties. While these are still relevant topics in the feminist discourse, they fail to challenge the root cause of inequalities, class and racial struggle, and disenfranchisement. Neither do they address the basic question of women's subordination within family and society. These challenges in their totality can actually be addressed if we take a more structural approach by studying the system that is allowing the challenges to perpetuate and reproduce. This can be found in an old economic and social system that is capitalism. Today, in our globalized world, we are met with the myriad forms of multi-gendered, multi-ethnic, and multi-layers and levels of abled subjects, all of whom are connected in some way, shape, or form in the globalized labor machine. This labor machine is what ensures the sustenance and perpetuation of capitalism. And I deliberately said that capitalism is both an economic and social system. For to look at capitalism as a mere economic system will limit our scope and will lead us to draw incomplete conclusions when attempting to address the issues of inequality, oppression, and discrimination. Understanding capitalism thus from both an economic and social perspective will allow us to account for the exploitative nature and factor in issues related to oppression. To understand capitalism, then, we must return to Marx, as Marx's methodology in deconstructing capital is done so in such a way that he does not discount the importance of the historical events in pre-capitalist societies. For the categories that Marx primarily deals with, namely capital, money, and labor, all pre-existed prior to the rise of capitalism. Just as patriarchal structures and the subordination of women have also existed prior to capitalism in different cultures and historical epochs. But to understand the current hegemonic form of patriarchy, for example, in its unique and almost universal form, and how it came to be along with the systems or global apparatus that have been placed using Marx's methodology will be a good starting point. The text we will be dealing with most today to set the stage for today's talk is Capital Volume 1, from which we will gain a more thorough understanding of the historical events that have resulted in the subordination and subjugation of women and the unfolding of events following the rise of capitalism. So in Capitalism, Volume 1, Marx is mainly dealing with the working class or the proletarian, in other words, labor. But capital, or Das Kapital, as a theoretical text, and I borrow from Titi Bhattacharya, is a text that is predominantly concerned with abstract labor or the value form of labor. So what Marx means by abstract labor is not concerned with any specific form of labor or work, but the capacity to labor or labor power. And this capacity is what the laborer sells to the capitalist, who then transforms this into surplus value or profit. Further, Marx brilliantly also positions these categories in their historical context and traces their ascension through what he calls primitive accumulation. At the same time, he positions these categories, capital, money, and labor, on a continuum to show how they develop in the future. Or to put it in Marx's words, constant expansion through surplus value extraction. This particular methodology has enabled Marxist feminists to pick up specific cues to situate the women's struggle in capitalism. For this operation or process to have taken place and to understand the woman's struggle, let us understand what Marx means when he says primitive accumulation. Marx tells us, and I quote, "The accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalist production presupposes the availability of considerable masses of capital and labor in the hands of commodity producers. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn around in a never-ending circle, which we can only get out by assuming a primitive accumulation, which precedes capitalist accumulation, an accumulation which is not the result of capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure." There's a lot to unpack in this passage, and it is best illustrated in the exceptional works of three Marxist feminists. I mean, there are many Marxist feminists who are great, but I'm going to be focusing on Silvia Federici, Maria Rosa Della Costa, and Maria Mais to formulate my thesis. The work of the three aforementioned feminists, when combined together, creates a cartography of what I call the fall of woman, or the amputation of woman as a being reduced to a mere simulacra or a representation of a thing. Their work also accounts for other minority groups, such as the peasants in the colonies and plantation slaves, who together with women enabled capitalism to grow and expand, or in other words, their subjugation was the input that capitalism required as primitive accumulation, or as Marx put it, accumulation which is not the result of capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. In Caliban and the Witch, Federici tells us, and I quote, "Marx introduced the concept of primitive accumulation to describe the social and economic restructuring that the European ruling class during the 16th and 17th centuries initiated in response to its accumulation crisis, and to establish that, one, capitalism could not have developed without a prior concentration of capital and labor, which was found in the farms and in the rural areas, and two, the divorcing of the workers from the means of production, not absence of the rich." And here, we can think of it as the rich, the wealthy class today, when instead of paying taxes, they would, funnel their wealth through philanthropy. So this is the source, this source of capitalist wealth. Primitive accumulation then consists essentially in the expropriation of the land from the European peasantry and the formation of the free, quote unquote, independent worker. Federici shows that by stripping away the European workers from their means of subsistence or livelihood, which then was their land, from which they extracted their means to live, and also moving beyond borders to the colonies through the enslavement of the Americans, or Native Americans and Africans, to the mines and plantations of the New World, the earlier capitalists began their process of accumulation. However, this was not enough to build the capitalist structure. Federici explains how Marx left out a very crucial historical event that to this day dictates gender-related discriminatory legislations. According to Federici, the process of primitive accumulation required the transformation of the body into a work machine and the subjugation of women to the reproduction of workforce. Most of all, she says, it required the destruction of the power of women, which in Europe as in America was achieved through the extermination of the witches. Finally, branching out of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, Federici shows that this process was not just about the concentration of exploitable workers and capital, but also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, where hierarchies built upon gender, as well as race and age, became constitutive of class rule and the formation of the modern proletariat. Mais, in Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, expands on Federici's theory by showing that, and I quote, "the historical emergence of European science and technology and its mastery over nature have to be linked to the persecution of the European witches. And both the persecution of the witches and the rise of modern science have to be linked to the slave trade and the destruction of subsistence economies in the colonies." So why the witch hunt, and what is its significance to our contemporary roles as women, and also of the roles of millions of migrant women How do we account for gender in our contemporary analysis of the global political economy and flow and circulation of migrant workers within the context of primitive accumulation? To quote Marx again, in the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capitalist class in the course of its formation. But it is true above all those moments when great masses of men, and I add women, are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled onto the labor market as free, unprotected, and rightless proletarians. The history of this expropriation assumes different aspects in different countries and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different historical epochs. According to Federici, this historical epoch, in the case of the European women, was the witch hunt that played the main role in the construction of their new social function and the degradation of their social identity. As Federici shows, from every viewpoint, socially, economically, culturally, and politically, the witch hunt was a turning point in women's lives. For the witch hunt destroyed a whole world of female practices, collective relations, and systems of knowledge that had been the foundation of women's power in pre-capitalist Europe and the condition for their resistance in the struggle against feudalism. This very same power has been the power of women in rural areas of the global south today, and we will later see how through colonialism and then neoliberal regimes following decolonization, Southern Asian and Latin American women went through the very same process. However, unlike the massive genocide of the 16th and 17th century witch hunt, these women were metaphorically burnt at the stake. Oh, is the sound okay?
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. Okay. So following the, these women were metaphorically burnt at the stake by being stripped away from their own subjectivity. Their lands were confiscated for privatization and thus forced into poverty through programs like the Structural Adjustment and Economic Liberalization led by supranational organizations like the World Bank and IMF. And as a result, they were forced to flee as migrant workers to survive. So following 2 centuries of mass extermination and terrorism, emerged a new model of femininity and the domestication of women, or what Mies calls the housewifeization. The characteristics of this new woman, according to Federici, naturally is wife, mother, who is passive, obedient, thrifty, of few words, always busy at work at home, and chaste. Along with that, Federici tells us that the construction of a new patriarchal order was placed, making women the servants of the male workforce. And it was a major aspect of capitalist development. But that was not all. Capitalism not only domesticated women, it also dumped a massive amount of unpaid labor, which took place within the confinements of the private sphere, and made it so seem as her natural disposition, and that when she performs this work, it is not labor, but an act of love. Everything from procreation to cooking, cleaning, and child rearing, unregulated by numbers of hours spent to ensure the wage laborer, or the breadwinner, in this case the man, was able to go to work the next day and the day after, or the reproduction of labor power. As Federici pointed out, Marx focused predominantly on commodity production by the waged laborer, ignoring, or to be fair, devaluing the significance of the unpaid exploitative nature of domestic work. This unpaid exploitative domestic work created an imbalance, which, by the way, was deliberately orchestrated by capitalism during the primitive accumulation period in order to acquire more surplus value, and resulted in furthering the divisions within the working class and extended it to the relations between women and men. This phenomenon did not go unnoticed by what I would like to call awakened or conscious feminists, who took their rage to the streets during the 50s and the 60s. And it was through the civil rights movement which paved the way for second-wave feminism, that women were able to protest against their exploitation at home and extend their demands for equal rights to the domestic sphere. So women were beginning to shake off the shackles of this rigid conformity that started off, following the whole domestication and then the Victorian women and then all the way to the 1950s, when they tasted their autonomy during the Second World War by replacing their male counterparts in the factories when the men went off to war. However, their independence was short-lived. After the war ended, they found themselves back in the kitchen. And this is also not so different from women in Kuwait during the Iraqi occupation, whose role was so prominent in the opposition movement, and who also found themselves back in the kitchen after the liberation of Kuwait. It is also worth noting that many civil rights organizations were led by women, particularly Black women. Now, a very interesting movement took place in that period across Italy, Northern Ireland, and America, known as the Wages for Housework. So along with demanding equal rights and opportunities in the job market, women also marched out to demand equal rights in the domestic sphere. In what I call Federici's Feminist Manifesto, Wages Against Housework, she says, wages for housework then is a revolutionary demand, not because it itself destroys capital, but because it forces capital to restructure social relations in terms more favorable to us and consequently more favorable to the unity of the class. She indicates, and this is very important, and that it's not so much a question about getting paid for the work we do as women at home, but more by making this form of labor visible so we may overthrow it and overthrow its intrinsic association with femininity. Unfortunately, however, capitalism, cynical as it is through 5 centuries of experience, managed to divert this minor mishap and found a new placeholder by outsourcing domestic work and creating class and racial divisions among women. And just as it restructured Europe in the 16th and 17th century, it reapplied this methodology in what is now called third world countries. But let us understand the nature of domestic work and how it relates to capital. Marx, in fact, dedicates a chapter for it in Capital Volume 1 called Simple Reproduction or Social Reproduction, depending on the translation. On social reproduction, Marx says, and I quote, "The capital given in return for labor power is converted into means of subsistence, which have to be consumed to reproduce muscles, nerves, bones, and brains of existing workers, and to bring new workers into existence. It is the production and reproduction of the capitalist's most indispensable means of production, that is the worker. The maintenance and reproduction of the working class remains a necessary condition for the reproduction of capital." So notice here that Marx is showing that capitalism is not concerned with the well-being of the laborer per se, or with the production of human beings or with future generations, but with the production of workers or able workers with the capacity to work. And this very statement also tells us that Marx doesn't exactly allocate space or kin-based relations to the process of reproduction, but leaves it open-ended. And therein lies the loophole that allowed capitalism to evolve when women protested against housework. So what then is social reproduction theory, and why is it relevant to understanding the global working class and how it manifests into this dead-end fate of migrant workers in general and domestic workers in particular? In a collection of excellent essays published in the book Social Reproduction Theory, Brenner and Laslett sum up SRT as the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions, and responsibilities directly involved in maintaining life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. It involves various kinds of socially necessary work, mental, physical, and emotional, aimed at providing the historically and socially as well as biologically defined means for maintaining and reproducing population. Among other things, social reproduction includes food, clothing, and shelter made available for immediate consumption. How the maintenance and the socialization of children is accomplished, how care of the elderly and infirm is provided, and how sexuality is socially constructed. That's quite a mouthful of jargon, but let's unpack and put it in simple English. What both the quote from Marx and the definition of SRT are telling us is how labor is restored to ensure the continuation or reproduction of the same labor over and over again. As Bhattacharya tells us, the means of subsistence must therefore be sufficient to maintain him or her, that is the laborer, in his or her normal state as a working individual. So remember when I said at the beginning that capitalism is both an economic and social system? This is where it becomes more relevant, as through social reproduction theory, we learn how the non-economic sphere is conditioned by the needs of the economic sphere, or the economic drive of capitalism. In Marx's words, the capitalist process of production, therefore, seen as a total connected process, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. Now that we have a rough theoretical and historical sketch of capitalism and social reproduction theory as it pertains to the domestication of women, let us move to a more practical understanding of how they manifest within a familiar context. While these previous discussions dealt with Western-based women's struggles, let us examine if these struggles are the same here in Kuwait, or how they are different, both conceptually and contextually. Since our concern is capitalism and ultimately the working class, I will situate my discussion within a system I believe, perhaps I'm wrong, that brings together the economic and social aspect of capitalism. This system is known as the Kafala, or sponsorship system. Why I chose Kafala as my trajectory is because Kafala plays a major role in the political economy of Gulf states, and also in how they operate and how we relate and interact with each other as a society, both in the public and private sphere. How so? Because our economies in the Gulf are predominantly made up of two major factors: oil and migrant labor. The former we will deal only briefly and generally in a very general way in this talk, but my focus is mainly on the latter. So most of the discourse, especially the Orientalist discourse on Gulf states, is based on the essentialist or reductionist view that it is due to the oil wealth, or even or ever since the oil booms of the boom of 1970s, the Gulf states accumulated this excess wealth, which enabled their citizens to sit back and enjoy it through the welfare system, and imported labor to do the labor work. Though it is true that the GCC is a hub for today's largest source of oil, abstracting from this reductionist view helps us understand the significance given to oil by the social relations within which it is embedded and thereby given meaning, as Omar Shahabi shows. So oil as a commodity in itself doesn't help us understand the political and economic dynamics of how the GCC countries operate, but it is through the relations, the social relations, it fosters as a commodity in order to reproduce itself that will enable us to understand the bigger picture. Further, an in-depth analysis of the histories preceding oil discovery in the region and how they've developed following the oil discovery is important to understand the way things are today. Since I've spent a lot of time speaking about primitive accumulation at the beginning, let us now see how it applies to the structuring of Gulf states. This is where I will begin with the Kafala system. Many scholars and researchers, especially those concerned with human rights and civil societies, believe that the Kafala was a product of oil wealth. However, this is not true, as Omar Shahabi's very meticulous research shows. According to Shahabi, the systematic import of foreign labor into the Gulf states began in the 19th century under British colonial rule. What particularly distinguished this type of migration was the organized import of workforce by a sponsor, in this case, the British administration, that did not have any cultural or geographical connection with the region. Migrants were systematically brought in by the British to carry out functions of colonial administration. Beginning in Bahrain and then Kuwait, the concept of sponsor became a regulation tool where anyone considered foreigner, and this was a very loose term back then, was under the British jurisdiction, whereas the locals were under the jurisdiction of the ruler. This process became important to regulate the entry of anyone on board, for example, pearl diving ships, which was the trade preceding the discovery of oil. However, following the discovery of oil and during its early stages, the British colonialists began increasing the import of migrant labor, who mainly came from other colonies, mainly subcontinent India. And regulation began to tighten, borders began to be drawn, and a new dawn of passports and immigration control took place. This was further exacerbated when Kuwait became the first GCC country to receive massive amounts of oil rents. This led to the dramatic increase in the number of migrant labor under British jurisdiction to work in the oil sector, according to Al-Shahabi. This was followed by the decolonization epoch across the world, which led to the nationalization of oil production in the Gulf. However, all the systems which pre-existed during the colonial rule became what was said in the beginning as a source of accumulation, which is not the result of capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. Kafala system was then this point of departure, for it was not carried out as a system of regulation, but as a source of surplus value extraction and reproduction of capital. Interestingly, in this period of what I like to think of as primitive accumulation for Gulf states, the pre-oil division of labor that is between foreigners and the local was already breeding class and racial divisions. When capitalist accumulation began to take form following oil in the early days, a few years before independence, using Kuwait as an example, with the enactment of the citizenship law and the residency law, and then not too far away, the constitution, we began to see the contours of class formations. Oh, sorry. According to Adam Hania, the process of capitalist class formations in the Gulf states has been accompanied by its dialectical opposite, the development of the Gulf working classes. Not surprisingly, the majority of these working classes were in fact migrant workers. Hania elaborates, no other region or country in the world has a working class that is so peculiarly formed, characterized by its temporary, unstable nature and a total lack of citizenship rights. This, Hania shows, is not an accidental structure, but a direct consequence of the Gulf's ascension as a core zone within the global economy. And this becomes even more evident when under neoliberal regimes and movements around the world demanding rights during the 60s and 70s, the Gulf states shifted their import to migrant labor from Asian countries. Hania and other scholars concur that any attempt by labor within the Gulf to mobilize or attempt control over the commodity value, that is oil, produced will greatly impact the stability of capitalism on a global scale. The shift to Asian migrant workers who did not share the language, culture, or to some extent even religion, and had no direct interest in enfranchisement, as opposed to their Arab national migrants, meant stability to the system. So how does the kafala system look like in the post-oil era, and how does it sustain the capital reproduction? So in this slide, which I'm very proud of because I did it by myself, you will see how kafala system, instead of beginning, with the individual sponsor or when the migrant enters, actually extends all the way to the sending country. And it's characterized by short contracts, flat wages, lack of internal mobility, and floating visas. So in this web, migrant workers have two different paths. So either they will enter the state to get their work permit and residency, and will either go to individual sponsors or business enterprises. Individual sponsors either are domestic work, commercial rent, or visa trading. As for business enterprises, they are mainly outsourcing these migrant labor to government contracts. Now, the commercial rent and visa trading actually are unfair to the migrant worker, because not only is the migrant worker actually, acquire debt or pay debt, get a loan to actually come to Kuwait or to the GCC, but also they will be forced to pay their individual sponsor rent, for this visa, for them to be able to operate here. The commercial rent is semi-legal, so for example, if we have people who come in and who want to open like a very small grocery shop or baqala, they will, in return, pay parts of that to the sponsor. Visa trading, which was the biggest issue for us during the COVID crisis and which was amplified, is one of the underlying problems of the kafala system. So the migrant workers also don't have agencies. For example, in the home country, recruitment agencies try to exploit them, or labor brokers try to exploit them. And then also in host country, recruitment agencies also try to exploit them. And they go through this, and the kafil also tries to exploit them. So this, in either case, is always a disadvantage for the migrant worker. So this diagram is what Sara Vanamutu calls the migration industry, which is an interconnected system of multiple actors that seek to accumulate profit from a worker's labor and migration. As we see in the diagram, there are multiple players who seek to profit off of the migrant worker, but the migrant worker is at the most disadvantaged, for he or she, in fact, received nothing. This chain, held together by the kafala system, acts as the function whereby social reproduction of capital is extracted through the migrant labor. So since the outbreak of the pandemic, the public discourse around abolishing kafala system or reforming the kafala system began to take shape. However, zeroing into this discussion, we actually see that these reforms, or what I call cosmetic reforms, are also class-based and insinuate gender and racial discrimination. For much of the reforms center around exempting a high-skilled or talented class of labor, which the states seek not only to exploit their labor, but also to accumulate other forms of capital through investments within the country, as opposed to them sending remittances back home. It is not surprising at all that despite the amplified coverage of migrant workers received in 2020 over the unlivable conditions, dire situations, and victims of visa trading, that migrant domestic workers were not included as part of the conversation. That is because domestic work, whether performed by the wife or paid domestic worker, remains devalued. As Sarah Ferris put it, commodified social reproduction, in fact, not only follows the rules of genderism and the sexual contract within the household, which establishes that women are still the subjects in charge of reproduction and care. It also follows the rules of the racial contract, according to which ethnic minorities and people of color are still those who perform the least desirable and valued tasks in society. Neoliberal regimes in the 80s included this new form of global sexual and racial division of labor. If we take the Philippines as an example, President Ferdinand Marcos is institutionalized the export of labor as an economic strategy. Today, migrant Filipino domestic workers are located in more than 160 destinations. Kuwait alone has almost 160,000 Filipinas, 99.4% of which are women. Their remittances sent back home is a major economic boost. As earlier mentioned, these neoliberal regimes brought in programs like the structural adjustment program, which I mentioned earlier, which led to absolute pauperization. The underlying result of these programs was this boom in migration. Federici tells us, in the aftermath of structural adjustment and economic liberalization, a restructuring of reproductive work has taken place internationally, whereby much of the reproduction of the metropolitan workforce is now performed by immigrant women coming from the global south, especially providing care to the children and the elderly, and for the sexual reproduction of male workers. So let us look at how the kafala system is the same diagram, but now with respect to domestic workers. Sorry. So while the law, the law holds responsible. So domestic workers enter the state just as their other migrant workers, but either they go through an individual sponsor immediately, So that happens through, for example, domestic workers already here, and then they tell their friends, and there's this network or family members, and so they don't have to go through recruitment agencies, and or they go through a local recruitment agency, and then that recruitment agency sends them to an individual sponsor. So in the home country, the recruitment agencies, for example, when I was talking to the workers in Sandigan, they were telling me how they, in the Philippines specifically, they market the Gulf states, and that they don't have any entry fee for that, and it's very and they try to market it in such a way that it's really nice and there's a lot of wages for them here, but they get surprised when they come here, especially because the recruitment agencies over there promise them a certain amount of wage, and when they come here, they are surprised that it's not the same thing, and they really don't have any agency over that because the contracts are not matching. In the case of individual, so when they go through recruitment agencies, and this is quite interesting, and this is quite common, that some of them actually are conditioned to accept physical abuse, sexual abuse. They put them in rooms where the conditions are poor. They give them limited food. And all of this is a conditioning. Why? Because the agency does not want them to return to them, and thereby they return this money or this sponsorship money back to the sponsor. When this happens, so some of them, if they end up leaving or escaping or running away from the home, they have different paths. Either they find a new kafil, or they become illegal freelancers, or they go to the shelters in the embassies, or some of them end up in prostitution, as we saw just like almost 3 weeks ago when Al-Qabas showed a documentary of the situation of Jalib al-Shuyukh, where we saw a lot of the women who were interviewed and who were labeled, prostitutes, were actually runaway domestic workers who did not have, who have not been paid for months, and who have, been abused by their kafil and now are, living illegally in the country. So what migrant domestic workers face under the system is this high risk of not being paid the already low wage, their confiscation of their passports, inability to leave the employer's residence, risk of no off day, annual leave, and this power differentiation where you are a worker or a khaddama and I am a madam. When these women escape, they are also followed, they face the issues that I mentioned. So despite Kuwait passing the domestic labor law number 68 of the year 2015, a study by the Kuwait Society for Human Rights actually showed how both the employers, the kafil in this case, and the domestic workers had little or no knowledge of its existence. Further, what makes implementing this law difficult, as Longva showed in her study on domestic workers in Kuwait, that the lack of kafala regulation of the domestic sector in Kuwait stems from the understandings of the private nature of domestic work performed at home and traditions of sexual segregation therein, making, for example, labor inspection by authorities difficult. So to conclude, as we saw historically how women were cut off and socially degraded during the early centuries of primitive accumulation, and how the rise of capitalism assigned to domestic work and consequently devalued it. And as women, we become more conscious of this. As women became more conscious of this and protested against it, capitalism diverted this work to lesser disadvantaged women, who won't demand much for payment. What this also did, as it created divisions amongst women and isolated a large number of women from access to basic rights of living or to being recognized just as human beings. And so the title of this presentation at the beginning is "You Pay Me for My Service, Not My Life." And it has a lot of nuances there. And it was actually a statement that by one of the domestic workers that I interviewed, and she said it to me 3 times. She's like, "I'm a human being. You're paying me for my service, not my life." But kafala system, when applied to domestic work actually turns this domestic worker not just, into a worker, but also into property, which is very similar to the slave trade. And so I end with what I call broken bonds of sisterhood. I came across this quote in one of my reading groups, and I give a shout out to my reading group, by Mudawi al-Rashid. And she said, men with surplus wealth were able to employ foreign domestic servants, and hence she's actually saying servants and not workers, to replace Saudi women in the domestic sphere. As a result of successive oil booms, women then had a double exclusion, one from the general economy and one from the domestic sphere. Oil wealth allowed many women freedom from domestic services and the traditional roles still performed by women across the globe, but it also deprived Saudi women of control over their own lives. This is a very interesting quote because for me, I think I was quite hit hard and hurt by this because it shows how we've internalized this whole idea of the feminization of domestic work, and that in the case of like Saudi women or women who are not able to join the labor market see this as some sort of like this is part of their territory. And when a domestic worker comes in, she's actually stripping that away from them. So she ultimately becomes the wife, the mother, the cook, everything else. And in both cases, when I look at this quote, I believe that both women are actually in this gray area, and there's no form of solidarity between them. So this is where I leave it, and I open up for discussion. Thank you for listening.